Good evening. This is the public consultation meeting for the draft bylaw 751-2022 concerning the sanitation and occupancy of maintenance of buildings. The draft bylaw is concerning, as I said, the sanitation, occupancy, and maintenance of buildings. There will be a question period dealing exclusively with this subject at the end of the presentations. Copies of the draft bylaw 751-2022 have been circulated. En français?
Oui. Bonsoir et bienvenue à l'Assemblée de consultation tenue relativement au projet de règlement 751 concernant la salubrité, l'occupation et l'entretien des bâtiments. Une période de questions pouvant exclusivement porter sur ce sujet se tiendra à la fin de la présentation. On a distribué des copies du projet de règlement dans la salle. Donc, voilà.
Merci. So the object of this draft bylaw will be presented by Étienne Lavoie.
Donc, d'abord, vous présenter le cadre législatif. En 2021, le gouvernement provincial a adopté la loi modifiant la loi sur le patrimoine culturel et d'autres dispositions législatives. Et dans cette loi, en fait, ça oblige les municipalités à se doter d'ici le 1er avril 2026 d'un règlement sur l'occupation et l'entretien des bâtiments. Présentement, la ville d'Hudson n'a pas de règlement sur l'occupation et l'entretien des bâtiments. Donc, ça va également obliger les municipalités à adopter des normes qui visent à empêcher le dépérissement des bâtiments, à protéger les bâtiments contre les intempéries et à préserver l'intégralité des structures. Et ça va également, cette nouvelle loi-là donne également des nouveaux pouvoirs aux municipalités afin de mettre en application les normes de préservation des bâtiments, par exemple au niveau de l'expropriation des bâtiments qui sont délabrés et également au niveau des amendes que les municipalités peuvent donner dans des cas de bâtiments qui sont laissés à l'abandon. Donc, for the legislative framework, so in 2021, the provincial government passed the act to amend the Cultural Heritage Act and other legislative provisions. So this act requires that municipalities adopt by April 1st of 2026 a bylaw on the occupation and maintenance of buildings. So right now the town of Hudson doesn't have such a bylaw. So it will require municipalities to adopt standards that are aimed at preventing the decay of buildings, protecting buildings from the elements, and preserving the integrity of structures. It also gives new powers to municipalities to enforce building preservation standards, such as expropriation of dilapidated buildings and also higher fines when buildings are left in an abandoned state. Donc, au niveau du projet de règlement de la ville d'Hudson, le projet de règlement 751-2022 a pour but de contrôler les situations de vétusteté et de délabrement des bâtiments qui sont situés sur le territoire de la ville. Ensuite, également, d'éliminer les nuisances qui sont générées par les bâtiments mal entretenus en prescrivant des normes de salubrité, d'occupation et d'entretien. Donc, c'est 3 volets qu'on va voir là, dans le règlement, et ensuite également d'obliger les propriétaires des bâtiments à les entretenir. So, object of the draft bylaw 751-2022 is to control situations of obsolescence and disrepair of buildings on the territory of town of Hudson, and then eliminate the nuisance generated by poorly maintained buildings by prescribing standards of sanitation, occupancy, and maintenance, and finally, to require building owners to maintain them. Donc, comme je mentionnais tantôt, la Ville n'a pas présentement de règlement sur l'occupation des bâtiments. Donc, présentement, quand il y a des situations de bâtiments qui sont abandonnés ou des situations d'insalubrité, c'est difficile pour les inspecteurs de corriger ces situations-là. So, like I mentioned before, the town doesn't have a bylaw on sanitation and occupancy of buildings right now. So when we have situations where buildings are left in an abandoned state or buildings are not properly maintained, it is complicated for town inspectors to act with the bylaws that we have at the moment. So we are a bit on a de la difficulté à agir. Donc, le projet de règlement est divisé en 7 sections. On ne va pas regarder tous les articles un par un parce qu'il y a beaucoup d'articles qui sont c'est technique, puis ça serait trop long de tout regarder. Donc, on va regarder vraiment chaque section, qu'est-ce que ça contient. Donc, la première section au niveau des dispositions préliminaires comprend là, les dispositions d'interprétation du règlement, comme par exemple les définitions des termes qui seront utilisés dans le règlement. Ensuite, la deuxième section au niveau des dispositions administratives, ça énumère les pouvoirs des fonctionnaires désignés de l'application de ce règlement. Par exemple, le pouvoir d'inspection, de visite des propriétés ou le pouvoir d'exiger, par exemple, des expertises pour vérifier la conformité de certaines situations. La troisième section, donc, il s'agit des dispositions relatives à la salubrité. Donc, dans cette section, on énumère des éléments d'insalubrité qui doivent être supprimés, qui doivent être enlevés, comme par exemple la malpropreté dans une habitation ou l'encombrement d'un logement. Ensuite, au niveau de la quatrième section, les dispositions relatives à l'occupation, on indique les normes et les éléments minimaux qu'un logement doit comprendre. Par exemple, toilette, lavabo, baignoire et douche, pour n'en nommer que quelques-uns. Ensuite, au niveau de la cinquième section, il s'agit des dispositions relatives à l'entretien des bâtiments et des composantes. Donc, on mentionne dans cette section-là les éléments des bâtiments qui doivent être entretenus, comme les revêtements extérieurs, les portes, les fenêtres et les équipements mécaniques, des choses comme ça. Sixième section. Cette section-là comprend dispositions relatives à la sécurité d'un bâtiment, comprend là, les dispositions reliées à la résistance à l'entrée par effraction. Et finalement, les dispositions finales comprennent là, les dispositions reliées aux infractions et aux pénalités. Donc, également, cette section permet à la Ville d'obtenir un jugement de la Cour qui lui permet d'effectuer les travaux afin de faire disparaître la ou les causes d'insalubrité. En anglais maintenant. So we will not go through all the articles of the draft bylaw because some of them are very technical and there's a lot of provisions, but so we'll explain all the different divisions. So Division 1, preliminary provisions, includes the interpretation provisions of the bylaw, such as the definitions. Then Division 2 is the administrative provisions, which list the powers of designated officials for the application of the bylaw. Powers such as inspection or the possibility to require analysis or this expertise from owners. Division 3 for concerning the provisions relating to the sanitation of buildings. So in this section, we list the unsanitary elements that must be removed such as uncleanliness of or the congestion of a dwelling. In Division 4, it's concerning the provisions relating to the occupancy of buildings. So in this section, we outline the minimum standards and items that a dwelling must have, such as a toilet, a sink, a bath, or shower. And then in Division 5, it's the provisions relating to the maintenance of building and its components. So this section mentions the elements of a building that must be maintained, such as the exterior cladding, the doors, the windows, and the equipment inside the house. Division 6 is concerning provisions relating to the security of buildings. So it includes provisions related to the resistance to forcible entry. And then Division 7 is the final provisions. It includes provisions related to infractions and penalties. This section will also allow the town to obtain a judgment from the court, allowing it to carry out the work in order to eliminate the cause or causes of unsanitary conditions. Donc, comme je mentionnais, on ne va pas regarder tous les articles du règlement, mais je pense qu'un des articles qui est important d'expliquer plus en détail, c'est le but principalement de ce règlement-là. C'est les responsabilités du propriétaire ou du locataire ou de l'occupation ou de l'occupant d'un bâtiment. Donc, le propriétaire, le locataire ou l'occupant doivent en tout temps maintenir un bâtiment dans un bon état de salubrité. Et ils doivent faire les réparations nécessaires et effectuer les travaux d'entretien afin de conserver les bâtiments ou les logements en bon état. Donc, un bâtiment ou une partie de bâtiment évacué en vertu du présent règlement ou vacant doit être clos ou barricadé de façon à empêcher l'accès, à prévenir tout accident et à assurer la santé et la sécurité du public. Et lorsqu'un bâtiment ou un ouvrage présente une condition dangereuse en raison de travaux, d'un feu, d'un manque de solidité ou pour quelque autre cause, le propriétaire, le locataire ou l'occupant doit prendre toutes les mesures nécessaires, y compris la démolition de tout ou partie de ce bâtiment pour éliminer définitivement cette condition dangereuse. Et on ajoute que ça n'a pas pour effet de soustraire le propriétaire d'obtenir les permis nécessaires pour faire les travaux. Donc, en gros, avec ce règlement-là, la Ville pourra désormais exiger l'entretien et la réparation des bâtiments basés sur des articles qui sont clairs, qui sont bien définis et qui ne laissent pas d'interprétation. So, like I mentioned before, we're not going to go through all the articles of the bylaw, but it's important to explain the responsibilities of the owner, tenant, or occupant of a building. So the owner, tenant, or occupant must at all times maintain a building in a good state of sanitation. They must make the necessary repairs and carry out maintenance work in order to keep buildings or dwellings in good condition. A building or part of a building evacuated under this bylaw or vacant must be closed or barricaded to prevent access, prevent accidents, and ensure the health and safety of public. And when a building or a structure presents a dangerous condition due to work, a fire, or lack of solidity, or for any other cause, the owner, the tenant, or the occupant must take all the necessary measures, including the demolition of all or part of this building or structure to permanently eliminate the dangerous condition. And so now the town will now be able to require the maintenance and repair of buildings. Ensuite de ça, il y a un élément qui est une nouvelle mesure qui est qui est amené dans ce règlement-là, c'est la procédure d'avis de détérioration. Donc, un inspecteur pourrait recommander au conseil de prendre toutes les mesures nécessaires pour que cesse une contravention à ce règlement, au règlement d'entretien des bâtiments. dont notamment un avis de détérioration, qui est une procédure là, qui est prévue à la loi sur l'aménagement et l'urbanisme. Donc, comment ça fonctionne? C'est si un inspecteur constate une situation problématique, un bâtiment qui n'est pas bien entretenu, la première procédure, c'est toujours d'envoyer un avis de non-conformité. Donc, un avis qui dit, voici, vous êtes en infraction, vous devez procéder à des travaux correctifs. Donc, si un propriétaire refuse de se conformer à un avis comme ça, d'effectuer les travaux, le fonctionnaire désigné pourrait recommander au conseil de faire de mettre un avis de détérioration sur l'immeuble. Donc, le conseil pourrait, c'est ça, requérir l'inscription au registre foncier d'un avis de détérioration. Par la suite, la Ville doit, dans les 20 jours qui suivent l'inscription de l'avis de détérioration au registre foncier, doit notifier l'inscription de cet avis-là au propriétaire de l'immeuble ainsi qu'à tout titulaire d'un droit réel qui est inscrit sur le registre foncier. Et par la suite, la Ville pourrait acquérir ou exproprier un immeuble sur lequel il y aurait eu un avis de détérioration. Donc, il faut que l'avis soit inscrit au registre foncier depuis au moins 60 jours et que l'une des conditions suivantes soit respectée. Donc, soit que l'immeuble est vacant depuis au moins 1 an, soit que le bâtiment, l'état de vétusteté ou de délabrement présente un risque pour la santé ou la sécurité des personnes, ou soit qu'il s'agit d'un immeuble patrimonial. Donc, par la suite, suivant cette procédure-là, si la Ville faisait l'acquisition, soit de gré à gré ou en expropriation d'un immeuble, la Ville pourrait soit l'aliéner, le vendre à toute personne, ou bien le céder gratuitement à une personne visée à l'article 29 ou l'article 29.4 de la loi sur les cités et villes, qui serait par exemple, l'immeuble pourrait être cédé gratuitement, soit un établissement public, une commission scolaire, une garderie ou un OBNL. So, Section 12, Notice of Deterioration. So, an inspector can recommend to council that council take all necessary measures to put an end to a contravention of this bylaw, including in particular a notice of deterioration, which is a procedure that is provided for in the Act respecting land use planning and development. So if an inspector gives a notice of non-compliance to an owner of a building and they don't do the corrective work, they don't cooperate and they just let the building go, then the inspector could recommend to council to that the council puts a notice of deterioration on the building, so that council registers a notice of deterioration. So if council decides to go that way, they must, within 20 days following the registration of the notice, they must notify the owner of the movable as well as any holder of a real right registered in the land register for this immovable. So after the notice of deterioration is registered, the town could acquire or expropriate an immovable after a period of 60 days when the notice has been registered. If one of the following conditions is met, so if the building has been vacant for at least 1 year, if the immovable's decrepit or dilapidated state entails a risk for the health or safety of persons, or if it is a heritage building. So it's either just need one of these conditions. And then the town may then alienate to any person by honorous title or by gratuity free to a person referred to in section 29 or 29.4 of Cities and Town Act, like a public institution, a school board, daycare, or a non-profit agency. Donc, au niveau de la procédure.
Je vais expliquer la procédure rapidement. Donc, il y a eu avis de motion le 2 mai et adoption du projet de règlement à cette même date. Puis, la tenue d'une consultation publique est requise en vertu de la loi sur l'aménagement et l'urbanisme. Donc, suivant la consultation de ce soir, le Conseil devra adopter le règlement à une séance ultérieure et il y aura par la suite approbation par la MRC pour que le règlement soit finalement en vigueur. Donc, the adoption procedure for this bylaw, there was a notice of motion and the adoption of the draft bylaw on May 2nd. Tonight is the public consultation in accordance with the law. And at a subsequent session, possibly July 4th, Council will adopt the bylaw with or without modification. And the bylaw will have to be approved by the MRC and will after that enter into force. Je vais revenir en français pour préciser que l'adoption du règlement peut se faire avec ou sans modification. Elle aura lieu possiblement à la séance du 4 juillet.
Et aussi, le règlement n'est pas sujet.
Ah oui. Également, je mentionnerai que le règlement n'est pas sujet à approbation référendaire. This draft bylaw is not subject to approval by way of referendum.
So this is it. We are now at the question period. So if there are any questions in the room, we will start there. Anyone have any questions, comments?
Louise Craig, 127 Charleswood. Got a question, Chloe. Many of the people that are going to be touched by this are either poor, elderly, mentally ill, or ill. So you're proposing to penalize these people who are known to be within the health sector, to be vulnerable. Are you not at this point penalizing them even more by putting this criteria on them? What if they can't afford to do these repairs? Are you going to expropriate, I guess, through an expropriation tribunal? Because I don't think you can just go in and take it, alienate it, and give it to somebody else.
My understanding of this bylaw that is really more for the life and safety of these people. There are some people who live in extraordinary circumstances that are very ill or very off-putting for their life and their health. So this is really to give the tools to the town to come in and be able to help those people out and put them in the rest of the system. There's the CLSC, there is a procedure on how to take these people in hand. I don't think the intent here is to acquire more buildings or to remove anybody's roof over their heads, but to make sure that people's health are taken into hand. We don't have that tool yet, so this is giving us better powers.
Yeah, I understand the need for a tool, but I also think there's going to be people that are going to penalize just because of the age of the demographic of our population, the age and state of the homes in general of Hudson, which are older. It's already known within the system that Hudson is vulnerable to this. So rather than penalizing them at this point, would it not be better and cheaper in the long run rather than going through an expropriation tribunal, rather than going through court? Because I would imagine you need a judgment before you would even be allowed to do this.
I don't know if the emphasis should be necessarily on the penalizing of these people, but rather giving the tools to come into assistance to them. And there is, whether that building is considered or identified as being of low quality with that avis that goes in the registre, that is really saying that the building is in very, very poor condition and no one really should be living there. So I think there's many, many steps before we get to that point. And it's not a situation of penalizing them, right? It's more being certain that people are not living in situations as we've seen on our territory in the past.
Yeah, but once adopted, this stands and they will be penalized financially because there is a cost that's associated to this. There's a fine that they have to pay. And this fine is a daily occurrence. So they'll be paying up to a maximum of $250,000 a day, depending on the severity of the situation.
Right.
Now, if the health system is involved, if somehow they have a social worker or a psychologist, psychiatrist that is dealing with the patient who still has to live within their home, and you can't extract them from that home, what are you proposing to do? Are you going to kick people out on the street?
I would think that when the building is in such poor condition that people can't live there anymore, it is to the benefit of that person to be removed from their home. Now, I don't think that those situations happen on a regular basis, right? Before it gets to that point, many, many stages will happen. So this is, and again, whether there is a notice of poor condition of the building, by the time the council would take that decision to either have it no longer livable, there's many, many steps. It's not an automatic. It doesn't mean that they automatically have a fine to pay. I think that all of those considerations will be taken into account before decisions made.
So there's about, I think the number that they projected was about 10% of Hudson homes would be in this situation. So we're looking at over 200 homes. And who knows how many people that would be.
No. I don't think that this would be used on 200 homes. This is really for the extreme cases and also in provision of heritage buildings that we may choose in the future. And again, this is really the Ministry of Culture that is looking to enhance the tools that are at the service of municipalities in order to protect their own heritage. So again, I think this is really just to give us better tools and not necessarily something that we use on an automatic basis at the slightest sign of decay.
This is adopted at the MRC also. So is this unanimous through it? All municipalities are going to be adopting the same bylaw?
Right. As Etienne had explained at the beginning, by 2026, le 1er avril 2026, all municipalities must adopt a regulation of this type. Je ne sais pas si c'est verbatim exactement, but of this nature, because that is one of the orientations of the ministry, is to protect health and safety, but also heritage.
So you're going to be going into people's homes. Do you need a search warrant for that?
Do we need a search warrant? I believe that an inspector has the right, as long as there is a sign of needing that. I mean, would you like to correct? I don't think they do it just because they want to. There has to be sign of deterioration and just cause to move into
But
that.
police need a search warrant to go into a house. I'm just wondering if inspectors need a search warrant. to
I
go
would
in.
think there has to be some sign of deterioration
Okay.
from the exterior.
Right. In the definition, some of the things that were a little bit confusing. So we're talking about the interior surface of a building. What if it's a log home or a cement floor? It doesn't have anything on it. Would that be acceptable? I mean, under the bylaw, the way that it's written now, the resident.
If it's just bare concrete?
If it's just bare concrete floor, would that be, because here it says it must be covered, the floor must be covered with an interior covering material. And the walls must be covered also. So
Pour
would
la
a log
salubrité?
house or,
C'est pour une occupation?
C'est pour l'entretien des...
ça, ce serait l'article, c'est C sur la page 11.
Floor maintenance?
Page 11, c'est sur le haut, premier paragraphe.
C'est l'article 20,
Ça, c'est,
section
je
24,
ne sais pas lequel article que c'est, mais c'est sur.
24,
OK.
paragraph C.
Right, at the top. Recouvert d'un matériau de revêtement intérieur. It's a good question.
Mais en fait, I would say the intent of this article is that if a room will be is meant to be lived in or to be used, there has to be a covering on the
A
floor
finish.
or exactly. If it's an unfinished basement, then an unfinished basement is not meant to be lived in or used regularly, I would say. But this is why we're having this
Mhm.
consultation, and maybe we can add a little.
But if it's like a heated
precision there.
slab, for instance, and I've been in houses, you know.
On
it's
pourrait
like they
rajouter
have
une
some-
précision.
Ouais.
Si c'est une dalle de béton chauffée ou une dalle de béton verni.
And there was the same thing, the bathroom also.
Ouais, ouais.
The walls and shower must be protected against humidity. They must be covered, waterproof. Would a shower curtain work at that point? Is that considered to be acceptable within this bylaw? Or
Well,
does it
protection
have to
against
be-
humidity could go as far as
I
paint.
mean,
that
yeah,
has a
exactly.
certain
It goes as
protection.
far as
Yeah.
paint. I mean, at a certain point, I think it becomes so restrictive that.
Well, I don't know if it's meant to be restrictive as much as it's the intent of it, right? You don't
Right.
want porous surfaces that are absorbing the shower.
Yeah, but and
Right.
another thing too, just at the very beginning, it says building any construction used in the intended use to house or receive people, things, or animals. Is a doghouse included?
Which article?
This is right at the beginning, Chloe. It's page 2, right at the top.
Page
Top
2.
paragraph, page 2.
They might mean farm animals.
Well, it just says animals. I'm just wondering, I mean, if you really wanted to be specific about it, it could affect a birdhouse, a doghouse. Could affect anything. I just think this is going to be, you know, like a lot of bylaws are so restrictive. They just end up costing a lot in legal fees.
I think you have to see this more really as something that we didn't have, that we needed in order to come into assistance to some people who really need it.
Right.
And some buildings that have value that we would like to preserve.
For sure, for sure. I'm just worried that the people that least can afford it are least prepared to deal with it.
So there's
are
always
gonna
an
be the
element of
most affected.
discretion, right, that comes
Yeah.
to the council's table, and that obviously would be something that a council would have to take into consideration with each decision.
Mhm.
Good point.
Yeah, anyway.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
Victoria Henderson, 224 Fairhaven. I have quite a few questions. Most of them are kind of just points of clarification. But generally, are we one of the first municipalities to try and go in concordance with this? Or did we look at any other?
Oui, on a regardé plusieurs autres règlements. Là.
Est-ce que ça fait longtemps qu'ils sont en vigueur?
Non.
Donc, ils n'ont pas eu la chance nécessairement de trouver les points plus problématiques?
Ben, certains, ça faisait 2 ans, puis il y en a un autre, je pense que c'était l'année dernière. Donc, parmi ceux dont on s'est inspiré. Là.
Mais
Ok.
tout règlement peut être ajusté et amélioré. Donc, c'est en pratique, en le mettant en pratique, qu'on va voir localement où sont les éléments à améliorer.
I know this council has a strong interest in heritage conservation and patrimony of buildings and the built environment. If the next council doesn't, does that give a bit of a different spin to this bylaw generally?
As I'd mentioned to Louise Craig earlier, there's an element of discretion. So even if council receives a recommendation from the fonctionnaire, from the inspector, how that gets then translated, I think, into a decision will be specific to each term.
Okay. I have quite a few questions about definitions, like just in the opening paragraphs, the third one, whereas the bylaw aims to protect. So poorly maintained is fairly, like maintenance is defined, but poorly maintained is not defined. Abandoned is not defined in this. Is that because these are things that are defined in a different subset of laws somewhere already?
So it was poor condition and
Poorly maintained
Yeah.
is, I mean, I could extrapolate based on the definition of maintenance, which is the act of keeping in good condition, which is again a bit.
yeah, it's
vague.
like the reversal, right? Because we
Yeah.
have in good condition, so the reversal would be in poor condition.
But neither of those are poorly maintained explicitly. I'm nitpicking because I'm curious about how this is all going to work together. But I don't believe abandoned is described anywhere. I don't know, maybe the civil code describes abandoned.
When a definition is not described in a bylaw, it's the dictionary definition that comes
Do
in.
we know what that is?
Abandoned depends on the dictionary, right?
I mean, is there a difference between abandoned and vacant?
Good
What
question.
dictionary do we use?
Do we want to define vacant
No.
as more than 6 months?
Well, vacant can be vacant and no one lives in there, but it's heated and it's being maintained. Abandoned is no
So
one.
vacant refers to occupancy, abandoned refers to total lack of maintenance
Like
on the
left,
immovable.
yeah,
That could probably use
specified.
some definition in the bylaw if that's the case, because that's a relatively clear distinction. For in section 1 terminology, where we define, or we say for deteriorated and in good condition, we say satisfactory and unsatisfactory condition. Those are also not defined. Like, where is the threshold for where it becomes unsatisfactory in its condition? Is it one person who's deciding these things, whoever the designated officer is? Are these things that will be defined in advance?
Further on, right, it says in section 10, the obligation to retain services of professionals. So I think that characterization would be done by a specialist. Would be my,
Is there a chicken and the egg there?
which is,
There needs to be a problem highlighted for unsatisfactory condition.
if
prior
there's a
to the
doubt,
expert
if there's a
being-
doubt, it could be the expert that qui va trancher.
Okay. Okay, in the definition for heritage and movable. So I'll actually ask another question that's further down. Okay, in section 4, this bylaw applies to all buildings except those owned by a public body. Does that mean the 3 buildings owned by the town that have the designated heritage status in the community are not actually subject to this bylaw?
I think we're intended on looking after our buildings is what it means, but. I beg your pardon? There's no residence in public buildings. No one lives at town hall.
So notwithstanding the fact that there's no one living there, the town is exempt from this bylaw. If someone was living in Halco Cottage, for example, or someone was,
You cannot expropriate Halcro Cottage. Is that what you're asking?
that is not what I'm asking. I do find it a bit curious that this bylaw, which can be interpreted as being rather punitive for some, or reaching maybe, it's actually not applying to its own buildings. And generally, municipalities will go above and beyond. They have often the means to get the funding. They're setting the example for the heritage buildings that they want to be restored. So for me, it was a little bit curious, which brought me back to the heritage and movable definition, where from what I understand, we do only have 3 buildings with a status, the lowest status of recognition available. So as a follow-up question, slightly related, is are we going to be seeking further designation for other buildings?
That would be my hope,
Will the town be seeking designation for residences?
perhaps.
Is anybody
En,
aware
en
of
fait, c'est
that?
que les MRC ont un délai pour préparer une liste des immeubles patrimoniaux sur le territoire. C'est pour ça que la définition dit les immeubles qui sont cités et les immeubles, là, je ne l'ai pas par cœur, là, mais les immeubles qui sont sur la liste, ou sinon on réfère à un article de la loi sur le patrimoine culturel, mais qui oblige les MRC à avoir cette liste-là avant. Ils ont un délai, là,
Ça, c'est la liste de M. Nopen.
Non,
Ah, non,
Non,
c'est-
ben,
non.
non, ben, la MRC va s'inspirer probablement de cette liste-là
OK.
pour avoir une liste officielle. Une fois que cette liste-là va être approuvée, cette liste-là va faire partie des bâtiments héritage de notre règlement.
Toutes les MRC doivent faire un inventaire du patrimoine.
Donc, c'est possible qu'un résident ait un statut reconnu sans avoir demandé.
Oui,
Oui, ça fait partie des changements de la loi en 2012, la
exact.
loi
Ça,
culturelle.
c'est au niveau du MSC,
Non, ça c'est au niveau de la
la
province.
province. OK. Bon. Definition of obsolescence, the state of deterioration produced by time. Who defines the time interval? If a building burns overnight, it is automatically obsolete in certain, I mean, depending on how fast the firefighters get there, it is generally obsolete in a period of 24 hours.
Right, but it says, and making it impossible to use. So if there's a fire, you would presume that it's impossible. to
So
use.
produced by time can be as little as 0 minutes.
What's the next part of the sentence that applies? Not that one.
It all applies.
You spend a lot of time reading the building code, I can tell.
Okay, section 6, the designated officer. This, in theory, would be a town inspector, DG, a certain person hired specifically for this role. the mayor.
Building inspector, I would think.
And members of the fire department.
Oui, c'est vrai.
Two
First-
people committee, a
prévention.
two-person committee?
Les officiers désignés pourraient être, par exemple, l'inspecteur municipal, pourrait être le technicien en urbanisme, pourrait être le préventionniste incendie. Ce sera au conseil à décider mais est-ce qu'on a déjà.
Mais il peut y en
soumis
avoir
la
plus
liste?
qu'un.
Oui, il peut y avoir plus qu'un.
Est-ce qu'il va en avoir plus qu'un?
Je pense que oui. À cause de la salubrité.
Okay, so there have to be two at all times?
No, it's a choice.
Okay,
You asked, will there be?
yep. No, I'm asking if there has to be at least two. So my recommendation, take it or leave it, would be that no decision is actually made unless at least two people are of the same opinion. So if
So
there's
it's a recommendation to council, so council makes the decision.
so nothing, no act happens other than, well, does the avis de
Non-conformité.
non-conformité, does that get sent before council's?
Goes to
consulted?
council. That was my understanding of your explanation earlier.
Non, un avis, if an inspector notices, let's say there's a building, there hasn't been, there's a hole in the roof, or there's no asphalt shingle, the inspector sees the situation, it doesn't conform to article whatever of this bylaw. So the inspector doesn't have to ask council to issue an avis de non-conformité because it's the bylaw and there's an infraction to the bylaw. So that he's just doing his job.
So at what point does council get involved?
If the avis de non-conformité hasn't been followed by if they haven't done any corrective work, then the inspector can recommend to council to register a notice of deterioration, and then council, they don't have to do it necessarily, and there will be many steps before getting to that stage, basically, of registering a notice of deterioration. So there's a lot of back and forth. We first do a verbal notice. We're going to call the person. Okay, if there's a problem, can you do something? If nothing happens after 2 weeks, we're going to do a written notice. Exactly. And then if nothing gets fixed, then we move on to the next option, the next, yeah.
Okay, I do think that things on the elements of this bylaw that touch the exterior that are clearly visible from the outside, I think those are much easier to approach and to deal with, particularly with the least invasive approaches. So the verbal notices, the written notices. I would think that most people receive those unless they cannot respond to those will. I do because this applies to the rest of the bylaw, and the bylaw has a lot of stuff about the interiors, particularly the site visit. I've listened to the motives and the goals of what you've explained. My discomfort with this is that it's not, we can do a site visit because we've noticed X, Y, Z, and because we have just cause. It's, we can do a site note, we can do a site visit whenever we want. We can have whoever we want with us. And as long as we come, 9 to 5-ish, you must let us in. That makes me quite uncomfortable. And what makes me even more uncomfortable is that that decision seems to be sitting on one person's shoulders. Even if there are 10 of them and they're all acting individually, I would much rather see a regroupement of 3 people where you can get a tiebreaker in there, and you can have, you have an incident, an email goes out to this committee of inspectors or designated officers, and they say, you know what, there's a hole in the roof. Everyone agrees, go for it. This is a situation that needs to be. I think things inside homes are going to be much more touchy, much more difficult. I think it's going to be very difficult to get inside of homes where the state of deterioration is advanced and the people are not tenants. Tenants, doors wide open. Occupant, owner, do not come here because it's none of your business. So I would like to see some redundancy in that decision-making ability. I think it would provide some comfort to people who do sort of get the heebie-jeebies when they read the details of the bylaw. I had a question similar to Louise about allowing, must allow the obligation to allow an inspector and whoever they choose to enter the home. I listened to the response. There's nothing in here that says that they need just cause. So yes, instincts and my natural reaction is they're not just going to do it. They've got other things to do, but the bylaw doesn't actually prevent them from doing that. So, I think to contracts often where both parties are equally protected, I'm not sure this provides equal protection to everybody. It may actually serve a strong goal or a strong purpose for those that are most vulnerable and need help, but there's nothing in here that prevents a middle-class home with a soffit hanging off for 2 months because they've been in Florida. Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of
Room for interpretation.
Right. Yes, thank you.
But
So-
again, I think that the intent of this bylaw is really for the worst cases. How do you define what is the worst case and where that goes? I do not expect that inspectors are going to make a habit of just barging in.
But there's nothing stopping them from doing it.
I hear you,
Yeah.
but again, I think that we have to have best faith and best interest, understanding that typically this is there for cases of hoarding or cases of, say, Meals on Wheels knocks on a door and they have real concern for the well-being of a person. Up until now, they haven't necessarily had the means to do more.
Those are called welfare checks, and the police do them. You know what I mean? Like, there's a fine line that's being sort of explored at this point by the municipality. And again, I understand the goal, but there are other, maybe not extremely well functioning, but there are other mechanisms in place to protect these people. If I showed up at my neighbor's house and I saw them on the floor, I'm not going to walk away and call the town inspector. I'm going to call the police, and they're going to come and they're going to do their welfare check. If I thought someone's life was in danger, I would also do the same thing.
This is more related to the condition of the building, right?
Yeah, but you know very well that sometimes the inside does not tell the same story as the outside. It could look fine on the outside, so they just never show up there. And that person who does need help is, like porters, for example. You don't really see that on the outside of the house. So we're not actually helping them.
Peut-être si je peux ajouter, il y a un comité régional qui s'appelle la trajectoire sur l'insalubrité morbide, qui existe depuis quand même plusieurs années déjà. On a des employés qui siègent sur ce comité-là au niveau de l'urbanisme, au niveau de la prévention, au niveau du département des incendies. Donc, puis sur le comité, il y a des intervenants du CLSC, des policiers. C'est ça, il y a même certains politiciens qui siègent. Et donc, les situations à Hudson, il y en a quelques-unes. Et souvent, c'est des situations qui sont amenées aux services sociaux par un membre de la famille ou par la police ou par des fois, c'est juste, il y a eu une inspection pour prévention incendie et là, le préventionniste a remarqué des choses. Et donc, la porte d'entrée d'un dossier, c'est pas on va cogner à la porte puis on va aller on va prendre une chance. C'est toujours, ça nous est amené soit par un membre de la famille. Et donc, présentement, ces situations-là, c'est difficile d'aller plus loin que on parle aux intervenants sociaux, on essaie de les aider. Notre préventionniste incendie fait dégager les sorties de secours, puis après ça, on ne peut plus rien faire parce que notre règlement actuellement ne nous permet pas d'aller plus loin que dégage les calorifères ou tasse les encombrements des sorties. Puis après ça, ben, on ne peut plus rien faire, on s'en va. Puis des fois, ben, il y a malheureusement il y a des situations qu'on ne peut plus rien faire. Puis il y a une fin qui n'est pas souhaitée.
C'est vraiment pour des cas extrêmes.
C'est ça, exactement.
C'est pas
Donc,
des cas de tous les jours.
Puis quand tu mentionnes que c'est pas toujours évident de le savoir, mais on voit les signes des bâtiments qui sont, la galerie est toute encombrée, les rideaux sont toujours fermés. Ça nous donne c'est des signes qu'il y a quelque chose qui pourrait se passer. Donc, puis on a un comité de la trajectoire insalubrité, donc on a des ressources. Maintenant, on a juste besoin du petit push supplémentaire.
Puis l'intention, c'est d'y arriver avant qu'un drame réel se passe. Ça, c'est d'être en prévention aussi, en mode prévention.
Puis j'apprécie ça beaucoup. J'aurai un certain niveau de confort pour protéger les personnes dont il n'y a pas cette inquiétude. C'est les éléments ciblés dans la loi, ils sont tellement généraux que n'importe qui pourrait être ciblé dans cet état maintenant.
Pourrait s'en servir.
Pour s'en servir. Moi, j'aimerais ça. Ça me donnerait un certain niveau de confort si ça serait les visites des lieux pourraient avoir lieu si, mettons, un cas est identifié par quelqu'un.
Par le comité de trajectoire, par exemple, parce qu'il y a plus qu'une personne.
Ou en dernier plus, tu peux avoir comme ou autre, puis c'est comme décidé par le conseil. Et au moins, on va avoir 6 personnes, 7 personnes.
Je pense que c'est un bon point. Là. On semble être ouvert à rajouter cette clause-là.
C'est bon. Okay, I'm going. I didn't get that far in the reading. So, okay. Section 7 for site visits. They're allowed to take samples, do testing, dismantle, construct, take samples again. Who's putting that stuff back? Who's fixing it? Who's responsible for that? Qui fait les corrections?
Spoken like a true architect over here.
Ça coûte cher. À un moment donné, si tu veux faire un échantillonnage en arrière dans le salle de bain pour voir s'il y a un vapeur en arrière, c'est pas gratuit à réinstaller. J'imagine que ça présume qu'il n'y a rien là. C'est pour ça que je voulais échantillonner pour la moisissure et des trucs de même. Mais si c'est des finitions qui vont être débolies, ben, il faut les rayer après. C'est peut-être quelque chose à considérer. Est-ce que vous avez des limitations qui sont envisagées pour, dans la même section numéro 4, accompanied by a person whose assistance or expertise he requires? That inspector can do a visit with anybody they want.
C'est dans quel? L'article 4?
Just before section 8 on page 4, the last point before section 8. where during a site visit, a designated officer may be accompanied by a person.
And
whose
your
assistance-
concern is?
Why is there no limitation? Can they show up with their friend? Can they harass someone who's,
Well, he requires in order to characterize the condition of the place. Would you like those
here, hold
words
my
to be?
beer, I gotta go inside?
No,
Like,
that is necessary for the evaluation, the assessment situation.
and who is deciding this?
I think
How
the
does that
inspector himself
inspector-
comes with a certain role and responsibility and a description of what he knows how to do or she knows how to do. It's not just anyone, right?
I would argue, surprisingly, that they are not qualified to make that assumption in most cases. Are they a recognized professional? Do they have the capacity to assess the condition of all these things?
If they've been assigned with the task of being inspectors, then yes, they do have the
You'd
expertise.
be willing to put the inspectors municipal, like, not personal CV, but their professional CV online so that people
No,
could
but
validate?
after that, it says if there's a professional required,
Yeah, but
right?
it's that inspector, again, it's that one inspector that decides everything. It's a lot of power.
The inspector could require the presence of a certified building inspector for a first inspection. And if that building inspector says, well, you need a structural engineer to assess the
Yeah.
condition of
Or
the
that-
foundation or something, then could be a structural engineer could be required. Yes, maybe the municipal, the urban planning inspector cannot call this, but we could ask a certified building inspector to help us in the first assessment.
So I think they're
But that's already
qualified to
there.
identify those issues that exist in the dwelling. But this says that they can require me, they can show up for a site visit without any reason to my home. They can force themselves into my home to inspect something for conformity. They can decide that it's not meeting a certain criteria as defined in this bylaw. And then they can force me to hire an architect, an engineer, an inspector, a soil something. They can force me to hire a chef because it's not like actually defined what the limitation of their power is. So, and I do like more of a worry to me is that maybe they don't know, like, maybe they just don't know the difference between their buildings. Personally, I don't really value the information that building inspectors bring forward most of the time. Shoot me, sorry, I don't. Most of them, they show up, they check their boxes, you get a 600-page report that comes out 10 minutes later. and all it
96
is
pages.
photos.
It's always 96 pages.
It's, I think there's an improvement that can be made, particularly when it comes to what professionals are being required, and what the owner is being required to hire. And also maybe some delays in there because they're not going to be able, in this current market, they're not going to be able to get an architect at their door in 3 days or whatever the daily fee table is. So I think that's there could be a time, a definition of some type of time delay where what's acceptable in order to undertake the phases. Maybe it's case by case, but I think you do need to establish some type of timeline.
But
with
my sense is
cases.
if it's not defined, then it's open, but I could be wrong.
Is that to the benefit of the town? Then all of a sudden you're just waiting for the report to come in for the next 6 months?
No, well, then that's when it goes to the second step, I would expect.
So it would, at what point, if the bylaw doesn't say I have 10 days to supply something or 2 months to supply something,
Mm.
someone arbitrarily decides that it goes into defiance, non-conformity?
But again, right, you almost have to live with that bylaw for a while, see how it works, and then adjust as needed. And
Sure.
presume that an inspector is not there to rough up a home or to disrupt someone's life, right? You have to presume that the intent here is to actually come to help the person. But anyway, all comments received and we will certainly adjust as
In
best as we
section
can.
10, excessive humidity is not defined. I don't know if there's like a threshold for, because a service basement, for example, has a much higher tolerance for humidity than a kitchen would or most of the rest of the house. We talked about before, you gave an explanation at the end for expropriation. When it gets to that final stage, if the property is expropriated, it can be given to anybody. The town can acquire it, but it can be given to anybody.
No, sold. The town could either sell it
Okay,
or give it to one of the organizations that I.
It's like a nonprofit
in that,
organization.
the nonprofits
School
that's listed.
board,
Okay.
daycare could be given to them or sold to an individual, any interested party.
Okay. For section 13, the notice ordering evacuation, similar comment to Louise. I think the Régie du Logement or whatever its equivalent is now has a ton of protections in place that would prevent, particularly in the case of tenants, not so much owner occupants, but I don't think you would be able to apply that without a court ruling. I think it would be easier to apply in the case of an owner than it would be in the case of a tenant, but I've seen some disaster situations where tenants are there and the owners want to redevelop, they want to renovate their lots, they can't get rid of their tenants because the tenants don't want to give up their rent and don't want to go anywhere else. They're stuck there and they seem firmly planted. So I'm not sure how applicable that would be in the case of tenants. For section 14, I'm almost done. For section 14 in sanitation, the storage or use of products or materials that emit foul odors or toxic fumes, again, very poorly defined. Like it's an extremely general, like, are we allowed to have chickens? I think we are.
You
We're allowed
think
to have
foul
chickens.
needs to be better.
Foul might need better. Like if I had chicken poop in a container, it would smell pretty foul. And then again, in the same section, point E, the congestions of a means of evacuation. I understand that, I appreciate the inclusion there, but it needs to be much better defined or referring to building code standards.
But does
and
it-
ES
yeah,
standards.
Right. But
Because-
does it not just mean that evacuation is being restricted?
Restricted, but that, again, restricted is not a defined term. If I have a school bag in my entranceway, my access is restricted. There is congestion.
But I don't
in
think
my
there would be
hallway.
an infraction to a school bag in front of. a
No,
grade.
no, but the bylaw allows it to be.
But I don't think it would, all bylaws, if you want, are written in a way that we could interpret them to the worst or to the best.
Yeah, but this is a very specific thing and it's specifically related to life safety and being able to exit the building. I think it might be worth sharpening the definition on that. Section 20, the connection of sanitary equipment. Does this point prevent the future integration of a gray water collection system if anybody wanted to do that? Because it says that it must be connected directly to the wastewater drainage plumbing. If
So,
someone
or a
wanted-
certified gray water system,
If someone wanted to do that, I'm curious because
We
we
could
have
add the
sustainability
exclusion.
goals as well.
right? Or a certified gray water.
Is there a requirement for water pressure as well?
Don't think so.
So it's, as long as it's dripping out of the faucet at 60 degrees?
Water is water. You just have to wait for it longer. Is
Okay.
there a requirement in the building code for pressure?
I think,
For fire protection, but not for
I-
use.
I think it's limited to fire protection. I don't think there is a minimum pressure in a resident, like in section 9, I don't believe that there is.
You know, this reminds me of the bylaw in Montreal, right? They have un règlement de salubrité. So there might be some elements dans le règlement de salubrité de Montréal qui se réfèrent ou qui vous aideraient pour certaines précisions. Ça fait longtemps qu'il existe.
In section 21, the third sentence starts well, it doesn't start, but it says occupant to maintain a minimum temperature. I just want to clarify if occupant is always the person that's living in the space that is in there. So if someone had, for example, a thermostat that's locked in a box, but they controlled it, like the landlord controlled it from somewhere else, that would be in contravention of this bylaw. If the occupant cannot control their own thermostat.
Well, the intent here is that they should be within comfortable norms, right? So
They
if
should be
someone
able to control
else
it,
is
yeah.
controlling it and they can't bring it up to a normal level.
I'm not sure that's what it says entirely, but I get it. 15 degrees for the last paragraph on page 9, 15 degrees Celsius is quite warm for a building that is not, a building that is vacant. Is there a reason that we chose it? Is that based on like other bylaws or something?
Other bylaws?
You could probably go somewhere closer to 10 and still be,
It depends about that dew point, right? In your envelope, where it migrates.
yeah, but 15 that's like, there's just heating costs for 15 degrees Celsius in the winter. Anyways, it's just a general recommendation. Usually they're lower than that. Louise brought up the interior surfaces, which I agree with. I think it's a point that requires a lot more pencil sharpening, particularly for the floor maintenance one, where you say with a waterproof finish. So ceramic is not a waterproof finish. It is a water resistant finish. The grout is porous and goes directly through a ceramic assembly. So it would be more accurate to say a water resistant finish or equipped with a waterproofing membrane. But again, are you guys pulling ceramic out to verify that there's a waterproofing membrane under there? Probably not.
No, I think water resistant makes sense.
Okay, I'll do one last one. Section 29, heritage buildings. Who's responsible for the heritage character statements?
It's that inventory that needs to be done.
So the MRC is going to produce the heritage character statement for any building that they identify as valuable.
The one that is required by the law. If we want to go further, that'll be up to the municipalities.
Okay. And are they the ones that will also define heritage quality of the building?
I believe that's according to what the ministry's criteria are, but I haven't gotten to that level of detail.
Thank you.
Bill Nash, do you have any questions? Okay. They're so polite.
Yeah, I'll make it quick. My understanding of the Cultural Heritage Act was to prevent demolition by attrition.
Mhm.
The idea that somebody could just abandon a building and then it
think
would
that's
get
fair.
past that
Mhm.
50%. Does this change the 50% designation beyond which a building is not recuperable? That, for instance, the house at Como Corners was torn down because or the living house, simply because it was decided by somebody, inspector's expert, that the building had reached the point where it was going to be more expensive to fix it than to tear it.
Yeah, I would expect that this should keep us from getting to that point where there's
Yeah.
such degradation that it's hard to
Yeah,
recuperate.
because that was always our issue.
Mhm.
Now, wouldn't it be wise because there's a lot of coercion in this thing, as everybody pointed out. And maybe there's be a bylaw, a complementary bylaw to incentivize people
Mm.
to bring their buildings up to code. I'm thinking specifically of a building that's right in our core. Well, several buildings are right in our core. They're nice buildings and deserve better treatment than they're getting. It seems to me that there's a kind of an inevitability to this, where you allow the owner says, no, I'm not going to fix it. I've still got tenants. The tenants, well, they're going to put up with it because there's not a lot of space. So I'm not in any rush to fix it. At this point, I don't see this law being able to
No, I,
tell the owner, you
Right.
want to fix it or else, because that's degrading.
this is really sort of more end of the road.
Yeah.
If you'd like, what you're speaking of is more a program, so a subsidy incentivizing people to maintain their buildings. And there is a provision in the law, as you know, since 2017, to create a heritage sector or a sector within which such programs can be put in place. And that hopefully will be one of the next steps that will follow.
Two more points. And this is important to both of us because we talked about this at length. How do you protect a building from that demolition by attrition phenomenon?
This is a good start, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there are all good questions that were asked.
Agreed.
One thing that didn't get hit on was section 19. Like if somebody's sewage treatment system, it's a bugbear of mine because I've always felt that the municipality should step in and make it a more of make it easier to determine whether somebody's private sewage treatment system was failing or on the verge of failing. And rather than just waiting for the neighbors to rat them out, which I think is sort of not the best way to do it. I think if a system's working, great. If a system's not working, then the town has a role to say. And in this case, that should be part of the continuum, like the other bylaws, 568, for example, which to my knowledge was never enforced, that forced people, well, you know what it says. It says people that live on the sewage treatment system have a legal obligation, and there were sanctions. There were the same phrases used here, penal sanctions, if you didn't connect to the sewage treatment system. So I guess the question is, how do we make this work for us in preventing demolition by attrition, giving heart to people that, for whatever reason, whatever mental or physical reason, they're not able to upgrade or upkeep their homes?
Mhm.
How do we incentivize that? How do we fix that? Can we give them a tax? Are we allowed to give them a tax break or take a lien on the house so that we can advance them the money to fix it?
Well, not all houses are worth, like, you wouldn't want to fix my house, right? My little plastic bungalow. But
Depersonalize it.
no, I know. But the point is that this is really for the worst case scenarios, the ones with the hoarding situations, the manque de salubrité. But in terms of heritage, then it is about creating those programs and incentivizing the owners of those heritage buildings. But first you have to say, this is why your building is worth something to the community. Hopefully you agree. And these are the characteristics that we would like to have you maintain and help you if we need to.
Now, then that hits to the next question. How do we make sure that owners are at the discussion, at the point of discussion when heritage buildings are being designated? Because otherwise you're just telling somebody, well, you've just lost carte blanche to do what you want to do
Yeah.
in your building.
And
do we do
that
that?
is a very delicate situation. So it is a lot about informing and bringing in consensus. There has to be buy-in, otherwise this will not work.
Are we still working with the Stantec patrimonial, no, not
Stantec,
Stantec.
Luc Napen.
Yeah,
I've approached him. Hopefully we'll be able to work with him in the fall. I know he's very interested, but he's very busy as well. So right now we are the municipality in the MRC that has the strongest inventory, thanks to the work of one of his students over a couple of years. And what they need to look at is this type of inventory, how to tweak it so that it can be useful for SPAPES and TPAC review, because right now It is more there as a characterization, but not necessarily as a tool. So this will be a really interesting process, and the more we can bring the public into that process and have them participate in identifying what is valuable, what is heritage. It shouldn't be institutionalized. It really needs to be the community that chooses to maintain its heritage.
Quite agree. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Mr. Nash.
It sounds very intrusive to me. Has this been vetted legally?
It's one of the earlier questions. So I believe there are some
I'm
towns.
sorry, I missed it. I was late.
There are some towns that already have a similar bylaw in place, some over a couple of years, some over some months. As far as we know, there has not been any issues,
There has been no challenges and there's no jurisprudence.
as far as I'm aware.
Okay, let's find that out, shall we? Because what bothers me, I mean, we're talking about buildings here, but I tend to think more about people. And la Charte des droits telle qu'elle est, nous dit que tout être humain a droit à sa vie, ainsi que la sûreté, l'intégrité et la liberté de sa personne, which also implies privacy.
Agreed.
All right, I didn't have to go very far on the chart because it's item number one. Item number two says, well, if somebody is in trouble, well, you sort of have the obligation to help. And I don't sense that spirit.
You do or you do not
I do
sense?
not,
Okay. I
okay?
believe
Because
that the
everybody
intent-
seems to be talking about bricks and mortar.
I believe the intent of this, and it says in the title, c'est concerning sanitation, occupancy and maintenance of buildings. So the salubrité est très importante pour la
Oui,
qualité de vie
évidemment, mais je veux dire,
et de la santé.
on ne parle pas de protéger la personne, on parle de se donner des droits, de rentrer dans la maison de quelqu'un et de faire la détermination que c'est protégé.
Je pense qu'il y a deux éléments. Il y a l'élément qui est justement le côté de la santé de la personne, s'il y a des concerns, et l'autre, c'est par rapport aux bâtiments qui sont patrimoniaux. Je pense qu'il y a vraiment les deux éléments dans ce règlement-ci. Et pour
Oui,
nous,
les
c'est
patrimoniaux.
plus un outil par rapport à la dégradation des lieux.
Donc, des patrimoniaux, présumément, ça voudrait dire qu'il y aurait une restauration, si c'est patrimonial. Ok, fait que pour moi, ça ne compte pas. Moi, je parle de Madame Lévesque, sa rue, je ne sais pas, tu sais, qui n'a pas les moyens, elle,
Je comprends.
puis,
Mais-
you know, are we compelling people to do things? And do we have the
I
legal
think
right
this is
to
what
do it?
Louise Craig brought up earlier and Victoria
Well, I know
Henderson
it's
as well. So
around it a bit, but, you know,
no, I know. I appreciate the comment, and I think that certainly will go a long way in our own thinking on this. But the intent, again, is to be responsible to the best of our ability as a public organization with regards to the health and safety of people, right? And if there's deterioration in a building, it may cause safety issues
Of
on
course,
neighbors as
of
well.
course, of
And there's a
course.
degradation as well as to la valeur immobilière and so on. So we have a certain duty in upkeeping or
well, actually,
encouraging
the
others to
property
upkeep
owner
property,
has a duty.
as do we.
You know, well, we have a duty to what, to detect if they're not doing it properly?
No, to maintain an increasing valeur immobilière.
Okay. Fine. Do we presently have somebody in the employer of the town who has the necessary qualifications and experience to be able to fulfill this job in this task in a human way?
I believe we have a couple of employees in town that have the competency and the ability and the experience and the knowledge of the territory to do this type of work. We have
In
an
this case,
inspector
how-
who's been here for a long
In
time.
this case, how would you define competence? What is,
I mean, this person has been working for the town in that function of inspector for 2 decades, 15 years, I'm guessing. Wait, John? 10 ans? I think
That
that's,
doesn't inspire confidence. What
would he still be working here if he didn't have the competency?
probably,
Well, that's not very nice.
that's not very nice, but probably. My question is, what kind of background does this person have? Is he an engineer?
Well, I don't
Is
think
he
an
a
engineer
retired
needs to be the
contractor?
person
Is he-
to run through this bylaw and to see whether it is active or not active.
I beg your pardon?
I don't think it takes an engineer to assess whether a property is sanitarily sound or not sound. The structural engineer will look at the
Well,
structural.
to make the judgment, but just by looking from the outside, I think it does.
But as we described earlier, there's a longer process to this. There is a whole trajectoire de salubrité as well. There's usually a long history before we get to this point. We just didn't have this tool to complete the cycle. And I think this is a positive for the town. It should not be seen as imposition or breaking of people's privacy. I do not think that this town is going to get into the habit of just barging in because now it can.
You hope that will not happen.
I wouldn't, where would be the benefit? Where would be the advantage? Where would be the necessity to do so?
Well, there's questions. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Are there other questions? Oh, Victoria.
You just said something that was very interesting to me. In theory, if there was a garage that was suspected of being used as a dwelling with plumbing inside of it, they would be able to go in there and inspect with this bylaw, despite the
I would expect.
conditions of the.
Un garage non fini que quelqu'un utilise comme une habitation, ce règlement donnerait le droit d'aller inspecter.
En fait, if there's let's say there's an illegal dwelling, we received a complaint or something like that, and we have reasons to believe that there is an illegal dwelling, we don't need the sanitation bylaw to get in there. We have a zoning bylaw that we already have the right to go on a property and
Already an
inspect.
infraction
Yeah.
to an existing bylaw.
Yeah, and we're allowed to go inside of a building to make sure that a zoning provision is being
Or
respected.
you already are allowed to go in to make sure there's conformity with the existing zoning bylaws?
Yes, of course, and if the problem is an illegal dwelling, the only way for the inspector to make sure that the bylaw is being adhered to is by going inside. So yes, it's in the chapter 2 of bylaw 526, where it explains what an inspector can do.
Okay, and if you just by chance happen to be entering under the provisions of this bylaw for a suspected need for aid, and you discovered not insalubrious, but illegal dwelling conditions, you would then have gained access via this, but would pursue for nonconformity to the zoning bylaw? Like there wouldn't be like, it would be haphazard that you came to that you would
I
say.
mean, if an inspector sees an infraction to the regulation, his job is to report it.
Right, okay. And can a tenant be held responsible for the condition and for the deterioration of a building?
I believe this goes to an owner, no?
Well, we would probably write a letter to the owner, because sometimes maybe the owner is not aware of what's going on inside of his building. So maybe we'd just give a call to the owner first. There's something happening, just like I said, maybe they're not even aware. And
Yeah.
then first thing they would like probably go have a look at their property and speak with their tenant. And then we start from there.
Okay, the last clause that talks about how any penalties, fiscal penalties can be like considered property tax, that kind of triggered the thought in my mind, maybe is the problem unsolvable if it's a tenant and not an owner? You know what I mean? I don't know if there's something there or not.
Thank you. Yes, please. It's a popular bylaw.
Sorry. Just because we've already gone through this in Hudson, you might remember this, Chloe. What if the person, this happened on Bellevue, Tim, you remember this, was living in a car or living in an RV? Do those constitute as
I don't think they're
a
removables.
dwelling?
That would be an infraction to the zoning bylaw. Temporary building or like.
But should that be also specified that this?
It's
could be
already
happening?
covered by this other bylaw is what it's.
It's already covered, okay. What if, Bellevue again, the house is not fully completed, it's under construction? Does it constitute as a legal dwelling at this point? Is it recognized? Does the municipality recognize it before it's finished as a
In
dwelling?
terms of occupation.
Yeah,
Tu veux répondre? J'ai une idée, mais je ne sais pas si j'ai raison.
c'est la maison sur Bellevue, c'est arrivé 2 fois, on a eu le même problème sur Bellevue, 2 différentes maisons, où est-ce que les maisons n'étaient pas construites. Alors,
N'était pas
pour- étaient pas
complété.
étaient pas
Elles étaient
complétées
pas
encore.
complétées.
Alors, s'ils ne sont pas complétés, est-ce que la ville les reconnaît comme étant une maison à ce moment-là, ou est-ce que ça doit être à un certain moment complet, oui, avant que la maison
Je
soit
pense
complète?
qu'il faut qu'elle soit substantiellement complétée pour être possible de l'occuper pour son usage pour lequel il a été intentionné. It's one of our definitions in our profession. So I would think that that's the one that applies.
But if the house is not finished yet, the
If it
town
doesn't have,
cannot-
say,
doesn't-
running water or plumbing, then that becomes where this bylaw could possibly.
Ben, en
come
fait,
in.
quelqu'un ne pourrait pas habiter dans une maison qui n'a pas l'eau aussi. They couldn't live there if there's no kitchen, no floor on the kitchen or no covering on the walls, then it's a house that's in construction. If there's a valid permit and it's in construction, therefore it's okay to, like, of course, not to have a wall covering and functioning plumbing and all the equipments, but when people start living in the house, it needs to meet all the requirements that are.
Great.
set.
Do we give an occupation permit?
yeah, that's what I like, as
Non,
far
on
as.
donne-
no.
on donne pas de permis d'occupation.
So there's no taxation possible until a house is completed, right? So does the town recognize it as a dwelling before they can possibly have taxation?
I think the
En fait,
value of
les
the-
évaluateurs, une fois qu'un bâtiment est habitable, les
Ouais.
évaluateurs vont mettre une valeur. Parfois, c'est une valeur qui ne sera pas à 100% parce que le bâtiment n'est pas complété. Mais une fois que c'est habitable, il y a une évaluation là, qui est envoyée.
Mais
mais
même en
j'ai-
cours de construction, il va
Durant
lui
le cours, c'est
assigner
ça?
une valeur, mais elle ne sera pas à 100% de sa valeur.
Mais je me
totale.
demande si légalement, vous avez le droit de prendre un droit de quelqu'un avant que la maison soit complétée complètement.
Mais c'est une valeur immobilière, c'est pas une question d'usage.
Je ne sais pas. Ce serait à un juge de décider à la fin.
Non,
Ça va
je pense
coûter
que c'est
cher.
vraiment
en
la
avocat.
valeur du terrain et la valeur de l'immeuble. C'est pas lié à son occupation.
Oui, mais
nécessairement.
ça va être la décision d'un juge à la fin. C'est pas la décision de la ville de faire ça. Il va falloir qu'il y ait un jugement qui décide ces choses-là. Ce
Mais
sera pas
c'est
d'un jour à l'autre.
l'évaluation foncière, donc c'est l'évaluateur qui détermine la valeur. C'est pas le juge.
Non, mais je ne parle
qui
pas de la
détermine.
valeur, mais déterminer si c'est vraiment une habitation là, que cette personne-là a à ce moment-là. Si la personne, comme on a eu sur Bellevue, on a eu plusieurs cas sur Bellevue, mais on avait quelqu'un qui habitait dans sa voiture à la fin. Et il habitait dans sa voiture, je crois, une année et demie là, à peu près. Sanders, habitait dans sa voiture. Il n'habitait plus dans sa maison à ce moment-là. Alors, je peux croire que, je comprends la raison pourquoi est-ce qu'on dit qu'on veut protéger la personne, mais la personne n'était plus physiquement dans sa maison. Et ça faisait au-delà d'un an et demi qu'il n'habitait plus dans sa maison.
Mm.
Mais à ce moment-là, c'est les dispositions du règlement de zonage qui s'appliqueraient. Là. On peut avoir, par exemple, des véhicules sur un terrain qui est vacant ou des choses comme ça. Là. Donc, il y aurait d'autres dispositions qu'on pourrait appliquer. Là.
Mais ça a pris des années, je pense, hein, pour ça douce.
Et je pense que c'est une des motivations, justement, ce règlement est là pour essayer d'éviter ce genre de situation, qu'elle se reproduise.
OK, merci.
Merci. Any other questions? There are two online? Yes? All right.
La parole est donnée à June Penny.
Hi, June.
Hi there. Just a comment. We who are
Madame
at our
Penny, est-ce que
homes,
vous,
can you
pouvez
hear me?
parler?
Est-ce que vous m'entendez? Do you hear me?
You hear her? We don't hear her.
Well, I hear you, but you
Yes,
don't
I
hear
you,
me.
dear.
Okay, there we go. So just a comment for future sessions. It would be nice if you could allow a person in attendance and a person sitting at home, like alternating points of view. That's just a comment from somebody sitting at home.
Thank you.
I wanted to allow more space at the community center tonight because I thought it would be packed. Anyway, so my comment is, or my question is, what inspired this whole bylaw? Like, why are we talking about what we're talking about tonight? What inspired that whole concept?
It's a requirement of the provincial government.
Okay, so that's good to know. And I very much appreciated all of Victoria's questions because I had a lot of those similar questions. And it's the whole thing about, you know, the privacy issue and where do you define the fine line of what's in a dilapidated condition, what's not. There are a lot of things that need to be defined, and I appreciated all of Victoria's questions and your comments. So I just wanted to bring that to the floor.
Thank you, June.
I had more questions, but Victoria asked all of them. So thank
She
you.
was very thorough. There's one more person.
Mrs. Eva.
Hi, Eva. Are you unmuted? Is she still online? Oh. Just says, don't forget questions online. Eva, it's your turn if you have a question. She's talking. That's what she says. We can't hear you. Is your microphone turned on? They say that on the screen, they do not see your microphone. Can you text me the question?
Phone call.
All right, Eva, June has another question. So I'll let June go. June, your turn. While
Yeah.
Eva's texting her question. So go ahead, June.
Well, if Eva's texting, we got to give her priority. Have you got it yet?
Not yet, but it says my question, so I'm guessing they're coming.
Okay.
Go ahead.
But I just wanted to say that also, the only reason I found out about this session tonight was at 5:30 this afternoon, as I'm checking my messages, and I'm seeing all this activity about going, what's this going on about this meeting tonight with Hudson? So I think we're a little lacking in the communication of getting out there, especially to the senior citizens of our town that are not on social media and on computers. And if you're going to hold sessions like this, and now that we no longer have a local paper every week, it would be nice to be able to establish a means of getting the communication out there so that everyone can communicate their points of views.
Yeah, these public presentations are standard procedure for the adoption of, I don't think it's all bylaws, but of some bylaws. It's true that the written handouts certainly reach a different group of people. And we've noticed that in the last few months. So we will certainly take that under consideration.
Yeah, and that's just my, like today, if I hadn't been on my phone at 5:30 this afternoon, I wouldn't have known about this. I had no idea about this bylaw, that proposed bylaw that was happening outside of the regular council meetings. So that's just an observation from a citizen out here that usually tries to keep in touch with what's going on. And I missed it if I hadn't been on my phone at 5:30 this afternoon. So
Thank
just,
you.
okay.
Yep, thank you. Eva, I don't have your questions. C'est bon? Eva, do you want to try again to speak in the microphone? All right, Eva. Anyway, I think this is it. She can ask me tomorrow morning. And oh, I keep trying, but it doesn't allow me. And even though it says I'm muted, so. Yeah, sometimes if you update the Zoom software for the next meeting, that might work. Or text really fast.
Peut-être un peu sortir de la réunion puis revenir. Des fois, ça.
À demain. C'est ce qu'elle vient d'écrire. Donc, à demain. Thank you, Eva. All right. Any other questions? No? So thank you, everyone. I believe this closes the meeting at 9:40 p.m. Thank you.
Tu vas faire un beau petit résumé de ça.